The security guard at Whitaker Meridian handed Caleb Vale a flattened cardboard box like he was doing him a favor, and the people behind the frosted glass wall of the 15th floor watched as he packed 3 things from his desk: a chipped blue travel mug, a charger wrapped with a rubber band, and a construction paper drawing his 7-year-old daughter had made of their old pickup truck with wings. Someone near the copier laughed under his breath. Someone else pretended not to hear it. Marla Trent, who had managed the operations floor for 9 years and carried herself like the building had been poured around her, stood by the elevators with her arms folded, her lips pressed into a pleased little line. Caleb did not defend himself. He did not ask for one more chance. He signed the separation paper, tucked the drawing carefully between the folder and the mug, and walked through the lobby with the same quiet face he wore when his daughter was watching him cross a street. Outside, a late October wind dragged brown leaves along the curb. Caleb set the box on the stone planter, took out his phone, and made one call. When the voice on the other end answered, Caleb looked back at the tower of glass and steel where men and women had just learned how easy it was to discard a man they thought had no name worth remembering. "Seal every server on 15, he said. "Get legal upstairs. Bring the board in before 5. And anyone who helped build this lie, end it today." 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had stepped off a red-eye flight into Kansas City with a canvas duffel, a shaving cut on his jaw, and a sleeping child leaning against his shoulder. His daughter, Nora, had curled her small hand around the collar of his jacket sometime over Colorado and had not let go even when the plane landed. She was 7, solemn in the way children become after hospitals and funerals and grown-ups whispering in kitchens. Her mother had been gone 14 months, and Caleb had learned in that time that grief did not arrive as one great storm. It came as 100 small weather changes, an empty passenger seat, a forgotten grocery list in a dead woman's handwriting, a little girl asking if heaven had night lights. Caleb had spent the previous decade moving wherever troubled supply chains sent him: ports in Texas after hurricanes, rail depots in Ohio after strikes, food distribution networks in Eastern Europe, a medical equipment corridor in the Philippines that had taught him how much a delayed truck could cost when people were waiting for oxygen. He knew how to repair systems because he had spent his life among the people who suffered first when systems failed. He knew warehouse concrete at 3 in the morning, break room coffee that tasted like pennies, the hollow look of drivers told to wait without pay because someone in a corner office had moved a number on a spreadsheet. He also knew, though very few people did, that Whitaker Meridian belonged to his family. His father, Everett Whitaker, had built it from one refrigerated route company into a national logistics and industrial services firm with contracts in food, medical supply, aviation parts, and disaster response. Everett had started with 2 trucks and an Army pension. At 72, he still walked the company's loading bays when his knees allowed it, still remembered the names of mechanics who had retired before Caleb finished college, and still believed that a company was only as strong as the ordinary people willing to tell the truth inside it. When Everett called and said the succession could no longer wait, Caleb did not ask for the chairman's suite. He asked for an employee badge, an hourly salary, and a desk on a floor where no one knew his face. "I need to see what you can't see anymore," he told his father. Everett went quiet for a long moment, then said, "Then don't let them treat you special." Caleb looked at Nora asleep on the couch beside a half-packed suitcase and answered, "That's exactly the point." The 15th floor was neither high enough to feel important nor low enough to be connected to the docks. It sat in the middle of the tower like a pressure valve, filled with compliance coordinators, vendor analysts, routing administrators, billing reviewers, and project leads whose work touched almost every contract in the company without ever appearing in a glossy annual report. Caleb arrived on a Monday morning in a washed gray shirt, khaki jacket, and boots polished clean but worn at the creases. The woman at reception glanced at his temporary badge and pointed him down the hall. His title was Operations Support Associate, a name dull enough to disappear behind. Marla Trent barely looked up from her monitor when he introduced himself. She was in her late 40s, her hair cut blunt at her chin, her reading glasses hanging from a gold chain she used like a warning sign. She did not speak loudly. She did not need to. Everyone near her seemed trained to lean toward her approval and away from her displeasure. "You'll clean up exception reports," she said, sliding a thick stack of misfiled carrier notes across the desk. "They're late. Don't make them later," Caleb said, understood, and carried the stack to an empty workstation near a pillar where the air vent rattled faintly overhead. By noon, he had discovered that the reports were not merely late. They were scrambled across 3 platforms, duplicated in 2 departments, missing source tags, and linked to vendor codes that had not been updated since the previous fiscal year. A younger man named Trent Huxley leaned over the partition and watched Caleb sort the first batch. Trent had a square jaw, expensive loafers, and a voice designed to make every sentence sound like an inside joke. "First day, and they gave you the trash pile," he said. "That's how we find out who's useful." Caleb smiled without lifting his eyes. "Trash piles usually tell you where the leak is." Trent stared at him a second too long, then laughed as if Caleb had said something foolish. Across the aisle, Elise Varden looked over. Elise was quieter than Trent, neat in everything she did, with a narrow face and the watchful stillness of someone who survived by knowing which way the wind was blowing. She took in Caleb's worn jacket, his plain lunch bag, the old phone on his desk, and the child's drawing he propped beside his keyboard. Her expression settled into a polite kind of dismissal. In the first week, Caleb learned the floor's geography better than he learned the software. Marla occupied the office with glass walls, though the blinds were nearly always half closed. Trent and Elise sat close enough to her door that no conversation could pass without traveling through them first. The rest of the team spread outward in rings of caution. There was Anita Bell, a freight billing specialist in her early 60s, who wore cardigans in jewel colors and kept peppermints in a tin for anyone brave enough to take one. There was Milo Ruiz, a veteran dispatcher with a bad knee and a habit of answering questions in numbers before words. There was Lacey Crane, who had been passed over twice for a supervisory role despite knowing more about hazardous materials documentation than anyone on the floor. There were younger analysts who kept their heads down, older coordinators who looked tired in a way sleep would not fix, and a few people who had learned to laugh before Trent looked at them. Caleb kept his own counsel. He worked through reports with a patience that had been hardened in harder places. He stayed late when needed because Nora's school had an aftercare program until 6, and because the apartment his father's assistant had found for him was close enough that he could pick her up, make grilled cheese, help with spelling words, and still read carrier contracts after she went to bed. On Wednesday, Marla dropped a vendor reconciliation project on his desk at 4:42 p.m. with a deadline of 8 the next morning. "You said you had international experience," she said, though Caleb had never told her any such thing. "Let's see if it's useful." He picked up Nora at 5:56, carried her backpack in one hand and a laptop bag in the other, listened as she explained that a boy named Cooper had called her lunch weird because she brought rice and chicken in a thermos, and waited until she was asleep before reopening the project at the kitchen table. Rain tapped the window. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry soap and toast. He worked until 2:15 a.m., corrected 83 mismatched entries, found 2 recurring billing errors that had cost the company more than anyone had noticed, and uploaded the clean file before making Nora pancakes shaped badly like stars. At 10 that morning, Trent stood in Marla's doorway accepting praise for catching the billing bleed in the reconciliation. Marla copied senior operations on an email congratulating Trent and Elise for moving quickly to protect margin integrity. Caleb's name was nowhere. He read the email once, glanced at Nora's drawing, and returned to his cue. By the end of the second week, the pattern was no longer accidental enough to be doubted. Work that improved the floor's standing floated upward under other names. Mistakes drifted downward until they landed on someone without protection. A missing attachment became Anita's carelessness, though Caleb could see the file had been removed after she sent it. A delayed carrier update became Milo's failure to communicate, though the timestamp showed Trent had held the approval for 31 hours. Lacey corrected a compliance template that Elise had built incorrectly, and at the next staff meeting, Marla praised Elise for tightening up weaknesses in the team's process. The cruelty was not theatrical. That made it harder to fight. It arrived in small, polished doses, each one explainable if examined alone. A chair removed from a conference room so someone had to stand. A meeting invite sent after a decision had already been made. A question phrased in public to make an employee sound unprepared. A smile when the person stumbled. Caleb had seen rough foremen curse and slam clipboards, but this was cleaner and colder, more dangerous because it left fewer fingerprints. One afternoon, Lacey tried to explain that a medical supply shipment had been flagged late because a contract code in the system was obsolete. Marla stopped her in front of 14 people. "What I'm hearing," she said, "is that you needed a machine to tell you how to do your job." Lacey's face went still. She looked at the carpet, then at the monitor behind Marla, then nowhere at all. "I'll fix it," she said. Caleb saw Anita's hand tighten around her pen. He saw Milo look down at his bad knee. He saw 3 younger employees turn back to their screens, relieved it was not them. That evening, while Nora sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor coloring a moon purple, Caleb recorded notes in a small black notebook he kept inside an old tax folder. He did not write accusations. He wrote dates, times, names, file paths, version histories, exact phrases when he remembered them. Nora looked up and asked, "Are those bad guy notes?" Caleb closed the notebook gently. "They're truth notes." She considered that with the seriousness children bring to moral categories. "Are you going to tell Grandpa?" Caleb looked toward the dark window where their small kitchen reflected back at them. One tired father, one child in pajama pants, one table covered with work that belonged to a company too large to see them. "When it's time," he said. Not before. Everett wanted updates, but Caleb gave him very little. They met once in a quiet diner on the east side, far from the headquarters and close to the old truck yard where Whitaker Meridian had started. Everett arrived in a navy overcoat and walked slowly. One hand on a cane he pretended he did not need. He bought Nora a slice of apple pie and listened as she described her new school, her teacher's butterfly earrings, and the way Kansas City smelled different after rain. When she went to the counter with the waitress to choose a sticker from a basket, Everett turned to his son. "How bad?" Caleb stirred coffee he did not want. "Bad enough that people have stopped expecting fairness." Everett's face changed in a way outsiders would not have noticed. He had grown up poor in western Nebraska and still believed waste was a sin, especially the waste of human courage. "Names?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "Not yet. If I give you names now, you'll move too soon." Everett gave a dry little laugh. "You think I'm that undisciplined?" "I think you love the company," Caleb said, "and I think that makes patience harder." Everett looked past him to where Nora was showing the waitress a gap where her tooth had fallen out. "Your mother used to say the same thing about me." The mention of Caleb's mother softened them both. She had died years before, long before Caleb's wife, and grief had made father and son quiet in different ways. Everett reached across the table and tapped the edge of Caleb's notebook, which was half hidden under a napkin. "Just remember this. Seeing the truth doesn't make you righteous. What you do after seeing it does. Caleb carried that sentence back to the 15th floor the next morning like a stone in his pocket. He knew power was waiting above him. He also knew that reaching for it too early would turn the entire exercise into theater. People like Marla survived theater. They knew how to speak in polished phrases, how to apologize for impressions rather than actions, how to turn accountability into misunderstanding. Caleb needed the structure beneath the performance. He needed the paper trail. The opportunity came disguised as trust. On the Monday of his third week, Marla assigned Caleb to assemble the framework for a sensitive audit involving several hospital system contracts in the Midwest. The work concerned route exceptions, temperature control records, and penalty exposure on medical shipments. It was the kind of project that could damage reputations if mishandled, and Marla presented it as though she were reluctantly allowing Caleb to prove himself. "You've been quiet," she said from her doorway. "Quiet people either know more than they say or less than they pretend. Let's find out which one you are." Trent smirked behind her. Elise watched Caleb's face. Caleb accepted the access permissions, built a clean tracking workbook, tied it to source documents, and created change logs more detailed than the department required. He noticed immediately that Trent had requested shared access through Marla rather than through the project channel. He noticed Elise asking for export permissions unrelated to her assigned section. He noticed Marla's assistant calendar a closed-door meeting titled Audit Cleanup, with no agenda and no listed file references. Caleb finished the framework 2 days early and left breadcrumbs no one would notice unless they knew where to look. Embedded version markers, permission alerts routed to an external legal archive Everett had authorized, and a silent notification triggered by any bulk download outside the assigned terminal group. He did not do this because he expected them to frame him. He did it because honest systems had locks, and dishonest systems always complained about locks before they broke them. On Wednesday evening, Caleb stayed late, finishing notes while most of the floor emptied. Nora had a school concert, and his neighbor, Mrs. Padilla, had agreed to save them seats if he arrived late. At 6:18, Trent returned to the floor carrying a gym bag and pretending to have forgotten his phone. Caleb heard Marla's office door open, then Elise's low voice near the printer. He kept typing. At 6:26, his permission alert blinked once in the corner of his screen. Someone had attempted to export restricted hospital contract data using his credentials from a workstation that was not his. Caleb closed the alert without reaction. At 6:31, a second export began. At 6:33, the legal archive captured the device ID, location, and user conflict. Caleb shut down his computer, picked up Nora's drawing, and made it to the school auditorium in time to hear her class sing the last verse of "This Land is Your Land." She spotted him from the risers, her face lighting with relief so pure it cut through every corporate calculation in his head. He waved once. Whatever happened next, he reminded himself, had to be worthy of that look. The next morning, the trap closed with such confidence that Caleb almost admired how little they feared consequence. 2 building security officers waited near his desk when he arrived. Marla stood beside them in a cream blazer, her expression grave, but not sad. Trent sat at his station with his hands folded, performing concern badly. Elise would not meet Caleb's eyes. A human resources director named Corinne Sutter appeared from the conference room holding a folder. Corinne had been with the company long enough to understand process and tired enough, perhaps, to confuse process with truth. "Caleb, we need you to come with us," she said. He followed her into the conference room, where Marla remained standing and the blinds had been drawn. Corinne explained that restricted hospital system data had been accessed and exported overnight through Caleb's credentials. The activity constituted a serious breach. Given the sensitivity of the contracts and the clear digital record, Whitaker Meridian was terminating his employment immediately. Caleb asked to review the access log. Marla answered before Corinne could. The evidence is not available to you. Caleb asked whether any device location mismatch had been checked. Corinne glanced down at her folder. Marla said, "This is not an interrogation. It's a separation meeting." Caleb looked at the termination notice. There it was, written in careful language: unauthorized extraction, breach of trust, immediate dismissal. He wondered how many people before him had been cornered by phrases like that, how many had signed because rent was due, because children needed braces, because fighting a corporation felt like shouting at weather. He signed only to acknowledge receipt, not agreement, and wrote those words beneath his name. Corinne noticed but did not object. At his desk, the 15th floor became theater again. People lowered their eyes. Trent leaned back as if watching the final scene of a movie. Marla walked near enough for Caleb to hear her say to Elise, "Some people tell on themselves eventually." Caleb placed his mug, charger, and Nora's drawing in the bar. He did not take the company pen. At the elevator, Anita whispered, "I'm sorry." It was almost too soft to hear. Caleb looked at her and gave the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, not encouragement, simply recognition. Then he rode down past the floors where his father's name was engraved on plaques and walked into the autumn wind as a fired temp employee carrying a box light enough to shame the people who thought they had taken something from him. The call he made outside the tower did not go first to Everett. It went to Whitaker Meridian's general counsel, a former federal prosecutor named Beatrice Holland, whose calm had frightened louder men than Trent Huxley. Beatrice answered with, "Are you clear of the building?" Caleb said yes. He gave instructions without drama. Preserve all 15th floor communications and system activity for 4 years. Freeze deletion permissions. Isolate the hospital contract audit. Gather device logs, badge records, camera footage, HR complaint files, performance reviews, and internal promotion notes. Notify Everett and convene the board. "Do not identify me until I walk in," he added. Beatrice paused only once after he told her to prepare separation documents for everyone directly involved. "You want terminations today?" she asked. Caleb looked through the glass doors where a receptionist was laughing with a courier, where life inside the building still believed itself ordinary. "I want the truth today," he said. "The terminations can wait until the truth has no place left to hide." He drove not home but to Nora's school because it was her early dismissal day and because no crisis in a boardroom outranked a child waiting at a curb. She climbed into the truck wearing a paper crown from art class and froze when she saw the cardboard box on the passenger floor. "Did you lose your job?" she asked. Caleb pulled away from the school slowly, letting a line of minivans pass. "Some people said I did." "But did you?" He smiled at the road. "That depends on who gets to tell the truth." Nora thought about this, then reached down and rescued her drawing from the box. "You should keep this on your new desk," she said. "It makes places nicer." He took her to Mrs. Padilla's apartment, where soup simmered with cumin and garlic, and the old woman asked no questions when Caleb appeared in work clothes, with eyes that had gone very still. "I'll be back after dinner," he told Nora. She wrapped her arms around his waist. "Don't be mean," she whispered. Caleb rested his hand on the back of her head. "I won't." She leaned back and studied him. "Even if they were?" "Especially then." By 3:40, Caleb entered the private parking level beneath Whitaker Meridian through a service gate that opened to a code only 5 people in the company possessed. He changed nothing about his appearance. Same gray shirt, same worn boots, same badge with the temporary stripe across the bottom. The executive elevator rose without stopping to the 34th floor. Everett stood at the head of the boardroom table when Caleb walked in. He looked older than he had at the diner, not because his posture had bent, but because anger had drained the color from his face. Beatrice Holland sat to his right with 2 attorneys and a forensic systems analyst. 3 board members appeared on screens. Corinne Sutter, summoned from HR, sat near the far end with the termination folder she had handed Caleb that morning, now closed in front of her like evidence against herself. She looked at Caleb, then at Everett, then back at Caleb as recognition assembled itself piece by piece. No one announced it. They did not need to. Everett's eyes went to the cardboard scuff on Caleb's sleeve where the box had rubbed against him. "Tell it," he said. Caleb stood rather than sit. He described 3 weeks on the 15th floor, the credit theft, the public humiliations, the manipulated assignments, the late-day deadlines designed to fail, the people trained into silence. He did not exaggerate. He gave dates. He named files. He described Lacey's correction, Anita's missing attachment, Milo's delayed approval, his own work reassigned upward, and finally the hospital contract export from Trent's workstation using Caleb's credentials. The systems analyst confirmed what the silent archive had already captured. The data had been accessed from Trent's terminal after hours. Badge records placed Trent on the floor. Elisa's login had approved an export request 6 minutes before the download. Marla's administrator permissions had modified Caleb's access scope that afternoon. The attempt to make the breach look like Caleb's was not elegant. It had only needed to be better than the company's willingness to look closely. Beatrice laid out the first findings in plain language. "This was a fabricated termination," she said. "The breach accusation is false. The evidence suggests coordinated misconduct by at least 3 employees, with possible involvement by others." Corinne's face had gone pale. "I wasn't shown the underlying logs," she said. Beatrice turned 1 page. "You did not ask for them." The sentence landed with more force than a shout. Caleb looked at Corinne and saw not a villain, but something perhaps more common and more dangerous. A person who had allowed procedure to substitute for judgment until harm could pass through her hands cleanly. Everett asked what Caleb wanted. There was no pride in the question, no ceremony. Caleb looked at the city beyond the windows, the roofs and roads and warehouses fading toward the river. "An all-company meeting," he said. "No warning to 15, no polished language. First we tell them who I am. Then we tell them what was done. After that, we decide what justice requires for everybody who had to live under it." The atrium filled before 5 with the uneasy speed of rumor. Workers came from accounts, compliance, dispatch, procurement, legal, sales, maintenance, executive support, and the warehouse office across the Sky Bridge. Some held phones, some whispered. On the 15th floor, Marla arrived early and stood near the middle with Trent on one side and Elise on the other, placed exactly where they could be seen. She had reapplied lipstick, Caleb noticed from behind the side partition. Trent looked bored, which was his way of showing nerves without admitting them. Elise kept checking the exits. Anita stood near the back beside Lacey and Milo, all 3 wearing the cautious expressions of people who had learned not to hope where management could see it. Everett walked onto the raised platform at 5 precisely. He did not use the prepared remarks Beatrice had placed near the microphone. He rested both hands on the podium and let the room settle. "I built this company to move things that mattered," he said. "Food to families, medicine to hospitals, parts to people trying to keep promises, but a company moves more than freight. It moves trust, or it breaks it." The room quieted until the elevator chime on the far wall sounded indecently loud. Everett said that the next leader of Whitaker Meridian had spent the past several weeks working inside the company without title or protection. because he had asked to see the truth at ground level. Then he turned toward the side corridor. "My son, Caleb Vale Whitaker." Caleb stepped onto the platform in the clothes he had been fired in. The shock moved through the atrium like a physical current. Heads turned, breath caught. A woman near procurement whispered, "Oh my God." Marla's mouth parted and closed again. Trent's bored expression collapsed first into confusion, then into something like fear trying to disguise itself as annoyance. Elise looked as if the floor beneath her had changed material. Caleb did not look at them for long. He looked at Anita, Lacey, Milo, the younger analysts, the people from other floors who had never heard his name but understood enough from the silence to know that something hidden had been dragged into light. Caleb spoke briefly. He gave his background without decoration. He said he had requested an ordinary assignment because leadership from a distance was not leadership at all. He said he had seen excellent work, quiet endurance, and failures of culture that the company would no longer excuse as personality conflicts or management style. Then he stepped back and let Beatrice present the preliminary findings. She did not name every detail, but she named the nature of the misconduct. A false data breach accusation, manipulated records, retaliation patterns under investigation, administrative suspensions effective immediately for involved personnel. She said the legal hold was active and independent review had begun. No one applauded. It would have been grotesque if they had. The room simply stood inside the weight of truth. After the meeting, the atrium emptied slowly, as if people were reluctant to disturb the air. Caleb remained near the platform while Beatrice's team delivered private notices to Marla, Trent, Elise, and 3 others whose access logs had already tied them to record manipulation. Security did not put hands on anyone. There was no public parade, no satisfaction staged for the crowd. Marla approached Caleb before she was escorted upstairs, her face composed by force. "You let this happen," she said quietly. "You could have stopped it sooner." Caleb met her eyes. "No," he said. "I let you show me whether it was a mistake or a system." She flinched, not because he had raised his voice, but because he had not. Trent refused to look at him. Elise looked once, quickly, then away. The 3 of them disappeared into the elevator with Beatrice and security, and the doors closed on the life they had believed could not be examined. Caleb did not feel triumph. He felt tired in his bones. He thought of Nora's instruction not to be mean and understood more deeply than ever that restraint was not softness. It was discipline. It kept justice from curdling into revenge. On his way back to the elevator, Lacey stepped into the corridor. For a moment, she seemed as if she might say something formal, something safe. Instead, her eyes filled and she pressed her lips together until she could speak. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said. "They kept telling me I was difficult." Caleb nodded because there was no quick comfort equal to what had been taken. "You weren't difficult," he said. "You were accurate." The sentence broke something in her, and she covered her mouth with one hand, turning away from the passing employees. Anita came up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Milo stood beside them, jaw tight. Caleb gave them privacy by looking toward the lobby windows. Outside, dusk had settled over the city, and the tower's reflection trembled in the darkening glass like something unsure of its own shape. That night, after Nora was asleep with a library book open on her chest, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with reports from Beatrice's office spreading across the scratched wood. He read until midnight, then 1, then 2. The investigation widened backward through 4 years of performance reviews, promotion denials, reassigned project credit, complaint closures, and settlement notes. The truth was larger than his humiliation. That was the part that mattered. By dawn, the file had become a map of quiet damage. 11 employees had been denied advancement after evaluations Marla edited or approved. 5 major projects had been credited upward to Trent or Elise, despite contribution records showing the bulk of the work came from others. 2 informal complaints had been routed back to Marla for manager resolution, which meant they died on the same desk that caused them. One former employee, a documentation specialist named Pearl Amato, had left after a retaliatory review described her as combative for challenging falsified shipment risk summaries. Another, Deshaun Keller, had transferred to a lower-paying facility role after being labeled not a culture fit. A third had accepted a settlement and signed silence in exchange for enough money to breathe. Caleb read their names aloud, softly, because names deserved sound. Everett arrived at the office just after 6 and found his son in the 34th floor conference room with his sleeves rolled up, Nora's drawing propped beside a laptop connected to a secure drive. "You slept?" Everett asked. "Some." "That means no." Caleb handed him the summary. Everett read standing, his cane hooked over the back of a chair. By the 3rd page, his hand had tightened so hard around the paper that it wrinkled. "This happened in my house," he said. Caleb did not soften the answer. "Yes." Everett lowered himself into the chair. For the first time in Caleb's life, he looked less like a founder than a father who had missed a warning sign at the end of his own driveway. "Then burn out what's rotten," he said. Caleb shook his head. "Not burn, remove, repair, document, make whole where we can." Everett looked at him, and something like pride moved beneath the grief in his face. "Your mother would have liked that better." The formal decisions took the rest of the morning. Marla, Trent, Elise, and 4 additional employees were terminated for documented misconduct. Their notices were specific, not softened by phrases like restructuring or misalignment. Corinne Sutter was placed under formal review for failure to investigate and failure to escalate. Caleb insisted she remain available to the independent review team but lose authority over active complaints until the review concluded. Beatrice agreed. Everett said nothing, which meant he trusted the line Caleb had drawn. Former employees would be contacted by outside counsel, not with defensive language, but with acknowledgement that records had been reopened and remedies were being evaluated. Every performance file on the 15th floor for the previous 4 years would be audited before it could affect pay, promotion, discipline, or transfer. A direct reporting channel would route to legal and to Caleb's office, with anti-retaliation monitoring built into payroll, assignment, and evaluation data. None of it sounded heroic. It sounded like work. Caleb preferred it that way. Late that afternoon, Caleb rode the elevator down to the 15th floor. He did not bring cameras, assistants, or a speechwriter. The floor looked rearranged by absence. Marla's office was dark. Trent's desk had been cleared of its framed golf photo and novelty brass nameplate. Elise's monitor was off, a square of black glass reflecting overhead lights. The remaining employees looked up one by one as Caleb stepped into the open workspace. Fear was still there. Fear did not vanish because a meeting had named it. It lingered in muscles, in email habits, in the instinct to save proof of every conversation. Caleb asked them to gather, and they did. Chairs rolled softly. Anita sat near the front. Lacey stood with arms folded, not defensive now so much as bracing. Milo leaned against a file cabinet to spare his knee. Caleb stood where everyone could see him and spoke as plainly as he could. He told them the terminations had been finalized for those whose participation was documented. He told them no one would be punished for silence alone in an environment where silence had been made to feel necessary. He told them the review would look at records, not rumors, and that if any of them had information, they could provide it without routing it through a manager. A young analyst named Bree, who had barely spoken in 3 weeks, raised her hand and asked whether people who had laughed along would be in trouble. Caleb let the question breathe. "Laughter can be cruelty," he said. It can also be fear wearing a mask. The review is not here to punish embarrassment. It is here to stop harm. Bree looked down, crying silently. No one mocked her. That alone told Caleb the floor had changed, though not yet healed. Lacey asked whether denied promotions would truly be reconsidered. Yes, Caleb said, with outside review, and with back pay where the record supports it. Milo asked whether managers on other floors would be examined too. Caleb looked around the room. Every floor, he said, including mine. Anita's voice came last, steady but thin. Why come down here yourself? Caleb thought of the executive view, the comfortable distance, the way leadership could turn human pain into dashboards if it was not careful. Because memos don't look people in the eye, he said. And I needed you to know I'm not asking you to trust a system that hasn't earned it yet. I'm asking you to watch what we do next. That answer did not fix everything. It did something more useful. It gave the truth a place to stand. The weeks that followed were not clean or cinematic in the way outsiders later tried to make them. There were attorneys, interviews, hard drives, policy drafts, uncomfortable meetings, and long silences from people who had learned that speaking honestly could cost them. Caleb kept the temporary badge in his desk drawer and wore his permanent executive badge only when security required it. He spent mornings on different floors, sometimes sitting in break rooms with mechanics from the service bay, sometimes listening to accounts. Payable clerks explain approval bottlenecks, sometimes standing beside dispatchers at 5:30 a.m. while coffee burned on a hot plate and drivers called in from icy roads. Nora noticed the change in his hours and complained that Chairman had too much homework. He agreed. On weekends, he took her to the old truck yard where Everett still kept the company's first cab restored under a tarp. Everett let her climb into the driver's seat and honk the horn, which made her laugh for the first time that season, without checking whether Caleb was laughing too. At home, Caleb pinned her flying truck drawing over his kitchen desk until she insisted it belonged at the office, where people need nicer things. So he brought it to the 34th floor and placed it beside his monitor, not as decoration but as a standard. The review restored Lacey's promotion with back pay and a public correction of her record. Milo received a schedule accommodation that had been denied twice under Marla despite medical documentation. Anita's file was cleared of 2 warnings that never should have existed. Pearl Amato agreed to meet with Beatrice and later accepted a settlement that included not only money, but a written correction of the record that had followed her into job interviews. Deshaun Keller came back to headquarters once, standing stiffly in the lobby in a jacket too light for the weather, and Caleb met him not in the boardroom but in the same diner where Everett had bought Nora pie. I don't know if I want anything from you people, Deshaun said. Caleb nodded. That's fair. I just wanted someone to say it happened. Caleb looked at him across the table. It happened, and the company failed you. Deshaun stared at the coffee between his hands for a long time. That would have meant something 2 years ago. I know, Caleb said. The words did not repair the past, but they did not insult it by pretending repair was easy. Corinne Sutter's review ended with her resignation. She requested a meeting before leaving, and Caleb granted it. She came into his office carrying no folder, no prepared defense. The skyline behind her was washed pale with winter light. I told myself I was following process, she said. That sounds worse out loud than it did in my head. Caleb waited. She looked toward Nora's drawing and smiled sadly. I saw people come through my office afraid, and I treated their fear like inconvenience. I don't know what apology is worth in that context. Caleb folded his hands on the desk. Usually less than people hope, sometimes more than nothing. She nodded, accepting the mercy of an answer that did not absolve her. Before she left, she asked whether he hated the people who had done it. Caleb thought of Marla's accusation, Trent's smirk, Elise's lowered eyes. No, he said. Hate is too much room to give them. Marla never apologized. Trent's attorney sent 2 aggressive letters, then stopped when Beatrice responded with logs precise enough to end the performance. Elise wrote 1 note, brief and careful, saying she had convinced herself that survival required cooperation. Caleb read it once and placed it in the file. He did not answer personally. Accountability did not require intimacy. By Christmas, the 15th floor had a new interim lead, chosen from outside Marla's circle and paired with an employee advisory panel that included Lacey, Anita, and a rotating junior analyst. The floor did not become cheerful overnight. People still hesitated before disagreeing. Some still documented every exchange. Trust returned in inches, not speeches. Caleb respected that pace. One snowy evening, after most of the building had emptied, he found Anita in the break room taping a small paper star to the vending machine. "For luck," she said, a little embarrassed. Caleb smiled. "We probably need more than one." She handed him a second star. He taped it crookedly above the coffee maker. Anita looked at him then. Really looked. No longer at the fired temp or the chairman's son, but at the man between those 2 masks. "You carried your box out like you'd done nothing wrong," she said. Caleb thought of the lobby, the laughter, the cold air outside. "I knew I hadn't. Most people still bend under it." He looked at the little paper star and the burned coffee stain beneath it. "I had a child watching how I stand up," he said. Anita's eyes softened, and she said nothing more because there was nothing more respectful than silence. On the first Monday of the new year, Everett formally stepped aside. The ceremony was smaller than the press expected. Caleb refused the hotel ballroom, the string quartet, the donor wall, and the staged video about legacy. He held the transition in the atrium, where forklifts from the warehouse could be heard faintly through the service corridor when the doors opened, and where employees from every level could stand without assigned seating. Everett spoke only briefly. His voice shook once when he thanked the workers who had made his life's work possible, but he recovered by pretending to cough, and Nora, standing beside Caleb, squeezed her grandfather's hand with all the solemn authority of a child who had appointed herself guardian of old men. When Caleb stepped forward, he did not promise greatness. He did not say family like a slogan. He said the company had carried freight across storms, shortages, strikes, and wars, but its hardest work would always be carrying responsibility for the people under its roof. He said leadership would be measured not by how it treated the impressive, but by how it treated the tired, the quiet, the new, the inconvenient, and the afraid. Near the back of the atrium, Lacey stood with her new badge. Milo leaned on his cane beside a younger dispatcher. Anita had brought peppermints in her tin and passed them down the row. Caleb saw them all. He also saw empty spaces where others might have stood if someone had listened sooner. That kept him humble, which was better than feeling victorious. After the ceremony, Nora tugged his sleeve and asked if he was the boss now. Caleb crouched so he was eye level with her. "I have the job," he said. "Being the boss depends on what I do with it." She considered this, then took the temporary badge he had shown her that morning, the one with the worn stripe, and clipped it carefully inside his suit jacket where no one else could see. "Keep this," she whispered, "so you remember." Years later, when people at Whitaker Meridian told the story of the chairman who once got fired from his own company, they liked the dramatic parts. The box, the call, the reveal, the silence that fell over the atrium when Caleb walked onto the platform. Caleb rarely corrected them, though he knew they were telling the least important version. The real story was not that a powerful man had been mistaken for powerless. The real story was what power became when it finally had proof and chose not to sneer, not to punish blindly, not to turn pain into spectacle. It chose to listen. It chose to repair. It chose to make a place where fewer people had to swallow humiliation just to keep a paycheck. On Caleb's office windowsill, beside the blue mug and beneath Nora's drawing of a truck with wings, the old temporary badge remained in a small wooden frame. Visitors sometimes asked why he kept it there. Caleb would look through the glass toward the lower floors, where lights burned late over desks he made a point of visiting, and answer simply, "That badge got me close enough to hear the truth." Caleb Vale's quiet stand inside his own family's company shows how integrity can turn an ordinary workday into a watershed moment. By refusing to mirror the casual cruelty around him, the temp proved that leadership lives in the courage to protect people who have no shield. Rather than lashing out, Caleb documented each injustice, waited for the right moment, and used the truth, not as a weapon, but as a tool, to rebuild trust, restore careers, and remind everyone that respect is never optional. His restraint teaches us that justice isn't revenge, it's repair. The badge that once marked him as disposable now hangs framed on his windowsill, a daily promise to listen to the unheard. We all occupy spaces, offices, classrooms, homes, where small decisions decide whether people feel seen or small. Let's choose the brave version. Now it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of courage that changed a room? Drop your story in the comments so we can learn from each other. And if you believe more people should hear stories that celebrate integrity and compassion, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Your support fuels this community and passes these lessons to the next person who needs them.